I will show you three very tricky approaches white can take if they are playing against the Caro-Kann, and I will also show you how you can prevent them and how you can make sure you don't fall for those tricks and get a quick loss. So we're going to take a look at the Caro-Kann, so e4, c6, d4, d5, and this is particularly the advanced variation, where white plays pawn to e5, which is the most common. So we have played bishop to f5, which is my favorite approach in the Caro-Kann. There are a couple of tricky lines that white can try if they don't go for the main IDs. The first one we're going to take a look at is pawn h4, which is known as the tall variation. And the main trick that white wants to set up here is that if you are not careful and you play e6, which has been played more than 20,000 times on lichess alone, you immediately lose the game. Because of g4, you have to move the bishop, f3, and of course this is protected. So you have to move the bishop, h5, and that's it. You basically lose the bishop for a pawn. So we don't want to fall for this. So my main advice if you face this is to just quickly play the move pawn to h5. And this makes it impossible for white to keep pushing. Plus we also have our pawn and our bishop working together here to stop a potential push to g4 by white. And then usually the white plan is going to continue with bishop to d3. Of course they don't have to play this, but it's the most played line, also the most played variation by grandmasters. Something else maybe is the pawn to c4 variation, which you can get when white of course tries to immediately attack your center, but I don't think there's any real problem. You can just go for the Caro-Kann triangle here, and whatever white tries, we are safe. You can even just go for normal development. This also supports the center. Maybe white can play bishop to g5, trying to pin your knight, but whenever something like that happens, usually you will be able to play queen to b6, which always attacks this pawn. And we are going to take a more in-depth look at that as well, but we are going to continue with bishop to d3. And as I have said this before, whenever your opponent offers you a trade of the light squares bishops in the Caro-Kann, usually you want to capture it, because this is a reversed bishop, and we want to trade it for this nice bishop from white. They will recapture with the queen most likely, and still you can continue with the same plan. We are just going for a solid structure here with this triangle. And in many of these tall variations, at some point white is going to play bishop g5. This might be right now, this might be in the other variation, this might be in a move or two as well. The main thing that white is trying to achieve is, first of all, just get a really nice square for their bishop, and also make this a little bit annoying. The queen has to move. You can always move the knight, but you would be pinning your own knight. Yeah, so that's not really nice. So this can be a little bit annoying, and it's just kind of a free developing move for white. And of course, f6, I mean, it's not unplayable, but you can run into something like queen g6, and yeah, I mean, it's a whole mess if you go for this. So I would always recommend, if white plays bishop to g5, just play your queen to b6. You have developed your queen is now safe, and we are also eyeing up this b2 pawn, which you can capture in some variations. And then white is going to continue, but they will still be tricky. Usually if they play the tall variation, their main goal is to try and lure you into some tricks. There are actually two things that are very common here. A knight e2 is the most common move. Knight c3 could also be considered. And the trap is simply that if you capture this with your queen, you will always get hit with the rook. And your queen doesn't really have a lot of space. You basically can only go to a3. And whenever that happens, you're always losing this pawn. Your entire structure doesn't really feel safe. Your king is not super safe. Like, all of these pieces still are not developed. This bishop is already cutting off some squares. So things can go bad really quickly if you fall for this. Another line that is really common, which we are going to continue with, is knight to d2. And it's basically the same idea. If you capture here, you get attacked, you got to move, or you could even capture the extra pawn. But still, this is happening, and this is always going to be trouble for white. So you don't want to capture this free pawn right now. If you look at this, well, there are actually multiple things you can do. I think if you want something simple, maybe knight to e7 can be played. For example, this. You can go knight to c5, knight to f5, castling, and then a position like this could be played. But I think the best approach is probably to go with the move pawn to c5. And there is actually a trick here with this pawn to c5 move. the trick is that now we are going to threaten to capture here on b2. And whenever the rook were to move, we can always dodge with the queen and go to d4, where the queen will be protected by the pawn. And we will be scooping up some central pawns, maybe trading the queens. And with the queens off the board, suddenly this entire attack by white is going to be less powerful. Plus, we have also managed to pick up some pawns in the process. Of course, many different moves by white are always possible. My main goal is to teach you the ideas, not the exact variations you have to study. Here, white can play pawn to c4, which is the most played variation, trying to really go for the kill, go for the attack, open up the position, so that, of course, the queen also gets a little bit more scope, the bishop here, and white is trying to go for the kill. But this is one of those moments, as I said, where you can capture here with the queen, and if you get attacked, you can just capture here. And you are able to capture these 2 pawns. You are also threatening the queen, so of course, if they capture here, you get a free queen. So white has to do something about this. Usually they will capture, and you can reach a position like this. And now, of course, a couple of things are possible. White can still take here if they want, or they can take here. It pretty much both leads to the same variation. And that is, we are going to kick away this annoying bishop with pawn to f6. The bishop has to move. And you also notice the bishop actually doesn't have a lot of squares, because this pawn here is also taking away one of them. So the bishop pretty much has to go here to f4. Now we can take. Again, we are attacking the bishop, so we are forcing the bishop to move. And now we can play pawn to b6. And we just have a really solid position here, and we are still up a pawn. White can take here, of course, but then we're going to capture here, and we are still up a pawn as well. If white tries to capture here, you can play the knight first, attack the bishop, develop here, and okay, the material is equal, but if we just play a couple of moves, you will see that this pawn is most likely going to fall really soon, because it's going to be hard for white to keep defending this. Another line that's possible, just to give another example, is of course if white captures here with the rook. That's also possible. The same idea applies. We play f6. Well, of course, white can always capture, but then they run into this, and all of a sudden it's always the same thing. If they capture, they are in trouble, because we are suddenly going to create a massive center of pawns, and we are still up a pawn as well. So the best thing to do is usually to move the bishop. And then here, even in this variation, taking this is not the best move actually. Here it is just knight to d7, which both threatens to take this and also protects the pawn. And yeah, not much to say really for white. If white plays any move, white can be in trouble. Even sometimes something like knight to c5 attacking the rook. The central pawn can be grabbed. And yeah, black just has a really solid center in these positions. So that is how I recommend playing against the tall variation. Just play a really quick pawn to h4 and then try to keep some of these ideas in mind that we have talked about. I think for specific traps like the tall variation, I mean, most of you probably won't need to study really in depth what to do against this. Okay, if you were to play over the board tournaments against 2000 plus rated opponents, yes, you would have to study this. But in general, if you're playing online, it's fine if you just know the general ideas of what to do against this. Next up is the Thunderwheel Attack with knight to c3. So we are going to skip ahead a little bit, and that is here white plays knight to c3. And knight to c3 looks really innocent. I mean, this knight is not really doing anything, so we are going to continue with our normal moves. Pawn to e6, and then all of a sudden white is really aggressive, and white plays this early pawn to g4. And that's basically what this opening is all about, trying again to actually trap this bishop, or at least create some problems on the king side. So the bishop has to move. Of course, you could also say, well, white can play some other moves. I mean, yeah, sure, white can always play some other moves, but there's nothing in this position for white that's really interesting. This is just a really simple Caro-Kann position. So we have to move the bishop. Of course, there's pretty much only one square. Bishop e4 is not really good because, of course, the knight can capture. This pawn is weak. You don't want to run into this. So we're going to drop back with the bishop. And white would like to go for a counterattack here with h4, h5, maybe f3, try and trap the bishop. We have seen this before. And if black tries to do something about it, maybe even g5 and just completely break open the kingside position. But white, yeah, pretty much has to wait a little bit. They can't immediately play pawn to h4 because otherwise you would just get this, pawn to h5, Taking here, of course, is never really good. I mean, we just got a free move, basically. And if they push, we are never really in any trouble here. If you get a position like this, it's always fine. You can just continue, for example, just gonna play a couple of moves. You can get a structure like this, and everything is fine for black. So white has to be a little bit more patient here, play something like knight to e2, which is the most common move. And my recommendation against this variation is to play an early h6, because white is being really sneaky with his knight to e2 move. If we are careless, let's say I'm just gonna play a move, let's say we just develop the bishop, for example. Many times the plan for white is actually to remaneuver the knight and then to just go ahead and capture our bishop. So I'm just gonna play a move. Many times the plan for white is to capture this bishop and then also damage our structure. So I always recommend to play pawn to h6 really early on, because now we just have a simple escaping square for our bishop. You can also play other moves. Let's just say we play another move. But still, as I said, if knight comes, it's always happening. And sometimes if this pawn comes, it's better to always have your pawn on h6 already. So you don't have to make a hole. Then you already have a hole, an escaping square for your bishop. So in this variation, I would recommend playing a pawn to h6. And that's the main thing to remember against this Thunderwheel attack. You just move back your bishop and then you play pawn h6 and you have a little bit of space in case you need to run and hide here. Let's say white plays, well, of course, if white ever attacks your bishop, we are just going to move it. That's why we created the hole, so it's not really a problem. If they play h4, I mean, yeah, nothing's really happening. You can even drop back the bishop, because if you play something else, you can always get hit. You can also drop back then, it's all fine. That's why we like to have this h7 square. But I'm going to continue with bishop to e3, just a solid move by white, still keeping things up in the air. We don't know for sure what's going to happen in this position. We can just play a developing move like knight e7, and then usually white will continue with something like queen to d2, because in many of these lines, I mean, this structure, of course, the white king cannot really castle kingside anymore. I mean, you can try, but your position has already been destroyed. So usually white wants to castle queenside, and then also push these pawns, swing over that rook all the way here, and just try to bring destruction down upon our king. That's the plan for white. And a fun thing to remember here, as black is, of course, many moves are possible. You could play something like knight to d7 and just let white castle, and then play b5 and try to go for a counterattack. I mean, that's fine. But we do have a little bit of a problem here. We would like to develop this bishop. But yeah, this bishop cannot really move because this pawn is stuck, and this knight is also stuck because the knight can actually not go here to f5. So okay, I mean, knight to d7 is a fine move, but we would also like to move this knight somewhere, because if we can't move this knight, we can't move this bishop, we can't castle, and that's going to be a problem. So how can we do this? Pawn to h5. And this might seem crazy, like we just moved pawn to h6 a couple of moves ago, now we are pushing to h5. Well, it's just a matter of playing the right moves at the right time. When we needed a safe square, we just played it to h6. It's the minimal kind of effort we needed to do to be able to make sure our bishop would never be captured. And now we are going to use the same pawn as a weapon to try and destroy this pawn on g4 so that we get a square for the knight. A couple of things are possible here. Usually capturing is never good for white because we always get this position. It's always fine. Protecting it, I mean, you can try this, but you're also opening up a juicy diagonal here towards your king. So yeah, you can try this, but still, let's just say they castle. We are gonna get some kind of queenside attack, sometimes even with c5, sometimes with queen a5, and you can keep things solid. Pushing is really common as well. White tries to push, but pushing also means we achieved our goal, because we now have a square for the knight. And you don't even have to play the knight right away. If you don't want to, you can. But you can also play knight to d7. You can mix up the move order. It doesn't really matter. Let's say they castle. And now again, I mean, of course, we can play knight to f5. It's all fine. But you can also play b5 and go for the queenside attack. As I said, it's about remembering these IDs. You will probably never remember this exact variation because you won't see these attacks by white so often, but if you remember these IDs, you will be fine in those positions. And here we are perfectly fine. If white ever still tries to attack our bishop, we now also have the f5 square for the bishop. And that's one of those advantages with not moving your knight up too early. Because let's just say we move the knight up, now we got knight f4, and now what's this bishop doing here? Yeah, it's a little bit annoying, right? Probably in this position even, you would just have to allow something like this. And it's still fine. I mean, the king is actually safe here as well. It's not really a problem. But if you want to keep your bishop, it's better to keep this square for the bishop. Just play something else, and then in the future play this. And you can always in the future play something like pawn to g6 as well and really get this structure. I mean, white is never going to be able to break through, and we still have some opportunities for attack on the queen side. Next up is the Bayonet attack, which I also have a complete video about if you want to watch that, but that video is more from the white side because I think this is one of the most powerful ways to try and destroy the Caro-Kann. So that is e4, c6, d4, d5, we push, bishop to f5, and then immediately g4. So this is a bit similar to the Thunderwheel attack, but it's quicker. We are immediately going for blood as white, playing pawn to g4. And you can play bishop to g6, and I can explain a ton of lines. If you want to see those, you can go watch the Bayonet attack video. But if you face this from the black side, my favorite option is actually this. Moving the bishop back, and just remembering that simple idea. Because if white plays the Bayonet attack, usually they are going to study what happens if you move the bishop back with h6, with h5. But if you just move it back to d7, there's not that much you need to know about this position, and you are still going to be safe. And you're not going to see this too much. At the same time, white also destroyed their kingside position, so everything is still fine. If white is aggressive, they might be wanting to go for the kill, play something like c4, but we can just play the Caro-Kann center, and this time it's just going to be with the bishop within the pawn chain instead of outside of the pawn chain. I mean, it's fine, it's still fine. Let's say knight to c3. And then what I really like to do here is, of course, multiple things are possible. You can always play bishop here. You can always play bishop, knight here, I mean, bishop to b4. All of those moves are possible. But what I really like here is to play the move pawn to c5, which is a bit of a counter attack. We always try to play this in the Caro-Kann. At some point you want to push c5. It's better to do it earlier on because we are kind of waiting for white to capture this so that we can recapture with our bishop. And okay, you might be thinking, well, am I not just dropping a knight, dropping a pawn here? But it's actually very tricky. For example, bishop goes to c6, and yeah, this doesn't look so good for the white player. Let's say this, all of a sudden, the knight is under attack 3 times. Knight's got to go back, take, and castle, and the king is within the center. So that's not a good position. And if white ever tries to capture here with their queen, so that's basically the entire plan, right? We play pawn to c5 and we try to bait them into this variation, which seems very good for white, but it's actually really bad for white. You're going to see this in a moment. Here we have the beautiful move queen to b6. So queen to b6, the queen and bishop are lined up, looking at this f2 pawn, and white is on the defensive. Queen g2 might be a move that you see. I actually don't know. There's not much to say. The only counter attack is trying to go for bishop c4. We're going to cover that in a moment. But usually queen g2 seems like the only way to keep everything together, right? And we can just develop, play this, and then play something like knight to b4. And this is already completely losing for white, because white always has to be careful, always has to defend. Now there's also this potential fork coming in, so maybe this has to be played. Maybe we can go bishop to c6, and white's gonna lose, and white will not even understand what happened and what went wrong. And even if they try to go for the counter attack, which is a little bit better, you can play bishop to e6 now, and the bishop is still being useful. The queen's gotta go, and then you can capture this pawn for free with a check. So if you face the Bayonet attack, really I would recommend just go for bishop to d7, as we have seen, and then try to be aggressive as well with the c5 push. You are going to be dropping the pawn in the center, but if white captures it, they are in big trouble. And if white doesn't capture it, let's just play a random move. We can always play something like this, weaken their position, something like this even, and then just continue with normal development as well. And then we are going to develop these two pieces. The bishop's going to go somewhere and the knight's going to go somewhere, and we're going to castle. So you are never really in any trouble playing against this Bayonet attack. If you want to learn more about the Caro-Kann advanced variation, I also have a complete separate video on that, and many more videos on the Caro-Kann are coming as well. That's it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.